Role, and good evening. Please welcome Anne Mosle and Dele Olojede.
Welcome to everyone here in the room and on the live stream to the Aspen Institute for what will be a very special and also important conversation with Pulitzer Prize winner and global leader, Dele Olojede. With the volume and the velocity of all that's happening in the world today, and also in each of our lives, I'm delighted that 500 diverse leaders from 9 countries and 41 states in the US registered to join us and be in conversation together. We have dignitaries and members from the diplomatic community, and especially a warm greeting to the ambassador from Rwanda. We also are delighted to have leaders from all sectors of societies and across generations. On behalf of the Institute, I'm delighted to welcome both new friends as well as long-standing friends and fellows of the Institute. As many of you know, the Institute was founded in 1949 as a global organization committed to realizing a free, just, and equitable society. We do our best to drive change through dialogue, leadership, and action to help solve some of the most important issues facing the United States and the world. In these complex times, our purpose is really about igniting human potential to build understanding and create new possibilities for a better world everywhere and for all. One where every child, every family, and community can realize their greatest hopes and wildest dreams. Now, why an In Conversation series? This was a personal endeavor that I began realizing that 2024 would be a very turbulent year where our societies, systems, structures, and selves would be challenged and tested in profound ways. I started in conversation with provocative and wise leaders to really create a space and a place where all leaders could step up on the balcony and consider the larger issues than what is confronting us each day. Like, can we be pluralistic? Can we recognize each other's humanity? Can we open our hearts and minds as well as our eyes to what is happening around us so that we can contribute to building a good society and be clear where there are threats and also where there are opportunities? We are delving into a very important topic tonight, and we have a truly extraordinary speaker with us, Dele Olojede.
Thank you.
Dele is a global thought leader, a courageous and probing journalist, humanitarian, and cherished member of the Aspen Institute community. As many know, in 2005, Dele was the first African to win a Pulitzer Prize for his coverage of the aftermath of the Rwanda genocide. Yet his exceptional career started in his home country of Nigeria, where he wrote for multiple media organizations. From the start, Dele courageously asked the hard questions, challenged corruption and injustice.
That was my younger version.
You might have heard some music in the air tonight, but his coverage also led to the release of the famous Nigerian musician and political activist Fela Kuti, where his dedicated and inquisitive coverage led to the freeing of Fela, and also the dismissal of the judge. So not only is he breaking people free, he's holding the system accountable. His determination has never wavered, and his work continues to focus critical attentions on the issues that matter. He invites us to look closer, not away, and to stay steadfast in our shared commitment to humanity and justice. Now, while Dele is a sought-after speaker of truths and trends, he's also created and curates important new global gatherings such as Africa in the World. Dele has received countless awards that are not only for his ethical and fearless journalism, but also as a humanitarian, social change innovator, and values-driven leader. He was a member of the first cohort of the Aspen South Africa Fellows program and continues to share and serve as an inspiring and inquisitive moderator and mission steward for the Aspen Global Leadership Network and all of the Institute Fellowship programs.
You can see that I'm here basically for tribal reasons.
Now, on a personal level, last March, I had the great joy and opportunity to travel to South Africa with Institute Ascend Fellows and the team, where I had the great joy of moderating with Dele, and also was inspired by many of the South African fellows and also of their children, leaders in their own rights, who just one is fostering mental health and well-being as evident in new efforts such as Waves for Change, thinking about the intergenerational nature of leadership and change. Following South Africa, I traveled to Rwanda. It was my first time. I went with Lola Adedokin and colleagues. We convened the Aspen Forum on Women and Girls SOAR Fellows. We went there to explore how a country can heal and rebuild with gender equity and equality as a central strategy for a strong future. I was awestruck by the creativity and the artistic brilliance of leaders like Hope Azeda, who are creating new songs and strategies and unlock the power of art and culture to imagine a new future and hope. So I invite you tonight to open up your hearts and minds for what is possible, what we can learn from our past to create a truly pluralistic, inclusive, just, and sustainable world. History is not the future, but it can offer powerful lessons as we consider the state of the world and how each of us can lead with passion and purpose. So now to the really good stuff. Dele, you were a firsthand witness, literally, in South Africa as Nelson Mandela became president. You covered one of the worst genocides, which nearly ripped Rwanda apart. Here we sit 30 years later. Can you share a little bit about what choices did these two countries make? What civic bargains or compromises did they need to strike? And what is working and what might need to be reconsidered? As an easy opener.
It's probably a useful way to look at what personal choices one made as a way of trying to understand what choices these two very, very different countries made. I was the correspondent, the bureau chief in Johannesburg in the early 90s for New York Newsday. And as Mandela had come out of prison a couple of years before, in February 1990, so everybody knew apartheid was ending. So we were covering this obsessively, and now we were getting to the end game. April 1994 was the final stretch of the campaign for a first democratic election that would see Mandela in the presidency in South Africa. So I was on the road with him and with de Klerk and so on. And then on the morning of April 7 or April 8, we began to hear reports that there had been some massacres and killings that were occurring in Rwanda. So South Africa had its election on April 27. The genocide began on April 7. So these two events were happening in parallel to each other. One, the highest and truest expression of what it meant to be a human being and to flourish on earth, an inspirational story of freedom. And the other was a story, the exact opposite, of mass bloodletting. But at that point, we didn't yet know the scale of what will confront us. And I was the only correspondent. I'd just opened a bureau in Africa in Johannesburg 2 years before. So I was the only one representing New York Newsday on the entire continent. And I had to decide whether I stayed with the Mandela story to see it to the end, where he votes and he gets elected president, as everybody knew would happen, or I abandoned that and go straight to Rwanda to go cover what appeared to be the beginnings of some communal violence and killings. So I chose to stay in South Africa. That was a a choice that even now, 30 years later, I could never resolve whether it was the right thing to do. And it may be a level of conceit, but one does possess certain levels of skill and determination and commitment to the craft that I couldn't help but think that if I had been there early enough, we would have written stories of such transcendental power that the Clinton administration would have been forced to commit to intervention. Remember, the whole world at that time was trying to call it something other than what it was. Because to call it genocide was to trigger Article 7 of the United Nations Charter, which mandated countries to forcibly intervene to prevent genocide. And this became law, international law, in the wake of the Holocaust, right? So everybody said never again, and that every country had the right to militarily intervene in a country where genocide was happening. So in order not to intervene, the United States and Europe and everybody else had to define it as something other than what it was. So anyway, I stayed in South Africa, covered the elections, saw Mandela vote at Oslange Primary School outside Durban, and then flew back to Durban, to Johannesburg that day to be in Soweto where the action was, and then waited until after Mandela was sworn in on the 10th of May, which will be 30 years next week, before I started making preparations to go into Rwanda. So I only ended up covering the tail end of the genocide. So Rwanda had always haunted me in that way. And so I went back year after year after year. And for the 10th anniversary of the genocide back in 2004, I assigned myself, because I could, I was the foreign editor, to go back there and go with a bit of perspective that distance affords to go try to understand really what happened there. Because when it was happening live and there was all these huge waves of people on the road and lots of killings, bodies in rivers and in wells and in banana groves, it was difficult to get perspective. But 10 years began to give you some sense of what this really meant and how, more importantly, how people were trying to construct a different future. So to answer your question, Anne, what I have seen has happened in these two countries was they took, understandably, completely different roads. South Africa came out of a history of dispossession and racial violence and unfreedom. So in reaction to that, they constructed the world's most liberal constitution, certified to be so by no less than the notorious RBG, who said South Africa has the world's most liberal constitution. South Africa has written into its founding document that gay people were free to marry like everybody else. They abolished capital punishment, and all of these things were done because it was a reaction against their 200-300-year history of dispossession, where the government told you who you could marry, where you could live, what kind of education you could get, and so on. Now, they are finding now, 30 years later, that this elaborate system they've constructed to guarantee their freedom, which they pride very well, somehow is not delivering effectively the social goods they crave. In the case of Rwanda, coming out of the genocide, like shocked and staggering into the sunlight, what they prioritized above all else was security. They just wanted to stop people from being killed. And so what has been constructed in Rwanda over 30 years was a system that, for example, does not necessarily allow for what we will call a flourishing, free media environment. And why did they do that? Because the media was used to mobilize the people to genocide in 1994. The graves are only half full. Who will help us fill them? This was continuously announced on Radio Milcolin to the people of Rwanda to galvanize them to murder their neighbors and their parishioners and their school pupils and their spouses and all levels of betrayal that happened in society. So when we outsiders rush into Rwanda and say, you guys don't have press freedom here, we fail to parse, to understand where that came from. So Rwanda's devotion has been to guaranteeing the security of the human being first, above all else, whereas South Africa's was to guarantee the freedom of human beings above all else. Both countries went in these two different directions because of their experience, which will suggest other things, but I think you have many questions, Anne, so we...
Well, you set the stage so beautifully, and two different paths and two different places now. Mm-hmm. And, you know, when we were together last spring, I remember, you know, you sort of have the highest ideals with the rejection and destruction of apartheid and white dominance and supremacy, and this beautiful pluralistic liberal path forward. Mm-hmm. But then when we were there, things aren't quite working as well. It's not always so neat. And, you know, how do you think of, you know, what are sort of the, what do you do when what's not working when you start so on the mountain with the ideals, and then you're kind of moving from liberation to governance and
then it becomes now difficult to fix the potholes and get the traffic lights to work and so on. You're now back to the humdrum of things, right? Because South Africa was coming from an extraordinary moral high. It was bound to not maintain that level because it was a once-in-a-century event. And Mandela was once-in-a-century leader, and the Constitution was written for the quality of Mandela's leadership, not for what human beings really are. Because the South Africans forgot about Kant's the crooked stick of humanity out of which nothing straight has ever been fashioned, and instead constructed this constitution that trusted in the goodness and moral certitude of leaders and their wisdom and their selflessness. And once Mandela naturally passed from the scene, because biology would always do its work, the successors, not surprisingly, were not going to match Mandela's level. So perhaps what was required was a system, as Karl Popper, I think many of us in the room understand Karl Popper's argument that most leaders are going to be hardly average and frequently below average. So you must set up a system that mitigates this potential. It's basically a risk mitigating system, a system of balances that prevents bad leaders from doing too much damage, while, of course, hoping for the best.
Yes.
Right? But he was not very sure that you were going to even come close to getting the best at any time. So he wanted to trust to a system that checked human power. South Africa's system trusted that it would have leaders of the caliber of Mandela in the euphoria of the moment. And so this constitution, this system of governing society, is easily manipulable by terrible leaders, as we've had with a guy called Jacob Zuma and a few others who had been there who have been less than satisfactory in delivering public goods that the country needs. Now, Rwanda, only by sheer luck, has possibly the most effective political leadership on the African continent today. Now, Rwanda has a somewhat authoritarian government. There is no sugarcoating that. And I apologize in advance to the ambassador, but that's what Rwanda felt was necessary for it, because the task before them was to try to bring a country back from the dead. Right. And so, as it happens, because of the intelligence and commitment and forward-thinking propensity of the leadership they currently have, they have effectively more effectively than any African country that I know, and more than most countries in the world, delivered public goods and did all the things that we would consider to be forward-looking and useful for society. They are, in fact, men are a threatened species in Rwanda today because the women dominate everything. So there's not even a system where you're saying, you know, we want equality for women. The women are in charge in Rwanda at all levels, in public and private sectors. It's like 60-65% women for everything in Rwanda, by design. When COVID hit, they got the vaccines into the arms of their citizens at rates that were far ahead of anyone else's. They have basic health insurance for the entire population, even though this is a very poor country. I mean, and on you could, but there is something that they do not necessarily have now, which is the kind of joyous freedom that you will see in the political space in South Africa. But South Africa, on the other hand, is having trouble delivering public goods because of this elaborate system it has created to guarantee all these freedoms. And so now, 30 years later, the young people are beginning to question whether this is the right thing for them. In fact, sacrilegious, some of them even say in public, maybe Mandela sold them out. I have friends in South Africa, people my age, who had been in prison, who had been tortured in prison, and so on during the fight for freedom. When they hear their children say this, they become so angry they are unable to speak. But perhaps that is precisely what they suffered for, to create an environment in which their children are free to say foolish things. But there is a serious attempt now that's going on in South Africa to try and re-engineer its political system so that it can get closer to the promised land. Right? So a lot of new parties are being formed, new systems are being attempted, and for the first time, in 4 weeks' time, it is almost guaranteed that the ANC, the ruling party, the party that used to be the party of Nelson Mandela and that sort of lost its way, will not get a majority of the votes in South Africa because the people were no longer inclined to continue to give it the benefit of the doubt as things deteriorated over time. In Rwanda, my guess is that one way or the other, they're going to have to shift. The question is when. Mm-hmm. Right? Because the farther people move away from the foundational impetus that led them to opt for a particular system, the less they are showing fidelity to that system. So my sense is, and one cannot possibly know the time, we were playing this parlor game when I was the bureau chief in Beijing in the 90s, covering China and Asia, that as the Chinese were getting wealthier and large numbers were moving out of poverty, they're going to demand that the Communist Party open up and guarantee more freedom because they are no longer the iron rice bowl generation. Now, we think that logically that should happen, but the killer is when. Nobody knows when. So the same with Rwanda. We cannot tell when Rwanda will pivot from its current system or whether it will amend or otherwise change it. But right now, it works for them. Mm-hmm. There is no question. If you visit Rwanda, you know it works for them. And I was there when all the rivers and all the wells and all the banana groves were filled with dead bodies. And the Rwanda you see today is a near miracle. I don't speak in those miraculous terms myself, being a lapsed Christian that I am, but it is well-nigh miraculous what has happened in Rwanda. And so that will sow the seeds of its own eventual questioning, where the younger generations will say, we don't want this anymore. Yeah. But when that would happen, it's anybody's guess. we're still waiting for that demand to happen in China.
Well, before we go to China, I'm curious, Dele, where it's interesting we think about what is a long time, what is a short time, and what leadership works at what time. And so, as I was sharing with you, thinking about earlier, going back to 2005, as President of Colombia, Lee Bollinger, was giving you your Pulitzer Prize. And, I'm sort of looking at that moment, and then you just touched down in New York a day or two ago. In this country, we are sort of in a whiplash moment in many ways. And I'm curious about, what leadership lessons you see from South Africa, Rwanda, or more broadly, what you're noticing here in the U.S. and some of those leadership insights.
So I sometimes, this has happened throughout American history, and so on. The semi-outsiders tend to see more clearly than the people inside. What I've observed was that the tensile strength of the United States, which has always impressed me the most, and which I overcompensate for occasionally, is that this country, more than most societies that I know, has such internal dynamism that it changes its direction when it's doing the wrong thing. Whether it needed the Civil War to do it or to attempt reconstruction, and when it's Jim Crow to do the Civil Rights Act and the voting rights law and so on, the country continuously pivots and tries to adjust when it's not doing the right thing. My worry these days is that the muscles are a little bit tired. And whether the country still has that tensile strength to pivot and change direction the way it has always done. Because our understanding of human societies and of human nature is that things don't stay fixed.
Yeah.
So a system is not going to be good for all time. And the capacity to continuously fine-tune it and sometimes to even jettison it entirely when necessary should be inbuilt into every system. And I think what we're experiencing now, I tell my friends that the three countries around which my life revolves, America, my adopted country, South Africa, where I live most of the time, and Nigeria, my native country, are all going through various afflictions in terms of social organization, political division, and just basically kind of seeming to lose their way. So whether the US would have muscle memory that allows it to pivot away from what seems to be very dark forebodings that we're getting, it's no longer clear to me, because I lost money in 2016 when I took a bet that the United States that I know will never vote for Donald Trump. I declared it. I was so certain. I put money on the table. So I'm very chastened. I'm no longer predicting anything. And so my hope is that the country has enough of a muscle memory to do what is always done throughout pivotal points in its history of changing direction. Because there is no way to create a system that works for all time.
Yes.
Right? So.
Okay, two quick last questions that would open up to the audience. One on your betting prowess. When you think about just how the stories and the paths of Rwanda and South Africa, sort of very clear and continue on the journey. We at the U.S. in 2026, we're going to have, kind of a 250-year mark of the legal framework milestone of our country. So at that moment, which, there's a lot of great things to celebrate and a lot of lore and narrative. However, at that beginning, it was set up for a certain population that came in with also a certain narrative. And there are quite a few that were not, conquest, conquer, but then also just left flat out. And so here we are at this moment, and we are not able to actually just state kind of our history. And that was when we talked about when we were sort of, with you in South Africa, and even reinforced in Rwanda, you cannot fix what you cannot face. You cannot address what you cannot acknowledge. And so we're sort of sitting here in this messy vertigo moment. Waving your leadership wand, what sort of thought, insights would you share where we both think about, as Mandela said in The Long Walk to Freedom, the great heroes, but then also the ordinary man and woman and people? Like, how do we learn how to step up and face a name?
I think that, as we know, and sometimes forget all too easily, it's the leaders that would galvanize a population in a particular direction. The leaders fit for the moment will have to emerge and guide us to a better place. People don't just do this by themselves. People are too busy facing their daily lives and trying to survive. And it's people who can reframe the big questions for the general population who emerge as leaders and people follow them. So for us to have the chance to do restitution for things that seem now broken, we're going to have to see those leaders emerge. And I think people have been generally despondent in America, as in many other parts of the world, because the leaders have failed to emerge this time, right? At least so far. Or maybe they're already there and we just haven't managed to see them yet. Because that's what can give us hope for changing our direction. That's the lesson of South Africa, that was the lesson of Rwanda, it's the lesson of almost any society on earth. When Deng Xiaoping went to Guangdong in 1980 and announced that it doesn't matter if a cat is black or white so long as it catches mice, he's signaling his country that they cannot go, that this communist dogma thing, we're going to keep calling ourselves communists, but we're going to shift direction, right? And then they've now had 40 extraordinary years of growth that has completely transformed their country, and an unprecedented event in human history where you move 800 million people out of excruciating poverty. It's a great achievement. But the system is now showing its outer limits of usefulness. And what happens to them next will depend on whether, like America or like South Africa or Rwanda, whether they're able to pivot or whether they're just going to hold on to that one thing because that's all they knew. And that path leads to chaos and disaster and so on. So the killer is always, when is the right time to shift from what we've always known, right? I think this country is suffering that. Many people are still shocked by the spectacle of January 7th, the Capitol, and senators running for their life, hiding in the basement somewhere. This is not the sort of thing that happens in the United States of America. This is what happened when I was growing up in Nigeria, and there's a military coup, and somebody says, "Hi, Colonel, so we've taken over the public radio, and we're taking over now." But here, it came as a shock that this thing that we thought we'd fix, the idea of democracy, has proved itself to be not fixed for all time, and is subject to the same reversals of anything else that you get anywhere else in the world. So that suggests to us it is time to step up, to start, tinkering with this thing and figuring out what is the best way to keep the vast majority of the population cohesive and on the right path again. So the French Revolution, they were saying those three beautiful words: liberté, égalité, fraternité. We've got to the point now where we're missing the fraternité part. It's no longer social cohesion and a community of love, of people that care for one another, that agree broadly on the nature of reality, even if they differ on tactics for reaching certain ends. Now people don't even agree on reality anymore. So the fraternité is long gone. There is still the liberty, and how we bring that back into focus as a way of helping us to fix to repair what has been rendered is not, I don't have an answer for you today, but maybe tomorrow.
Tomorrow. So come back tomorrow, we'll be taking that on, because this is one where I just think where the words never again ring so true through the essence of the body, to the heart, when I think about experience outside the US, but then we're almost like never remember. And never remember, but that also, what is it going to mean to set those conditions for conversations we're not able to have, whether leaders are fearful, they don't have the leadership agility or curiosity, or just downright fear. And I just, we might come back to it in a little bit, but I'm going to open up some to the questions first. But I'm curious, for all of you are curious, values-based leaders here, you know, how are you thinking about these issues globally or in your own world or life? And I'm sorry, and if you can introduce yourself with just your name and your organization, and please, a question.
Thank you. So thank you for your brilliant comments. My name is Martina Vandenberg. I'm from the Human Trafficking Legal Center. And in the United States today, there is major outrage and uprisings on U.S. campuses across the country, with nearly 2,000 arrests of students and faculty. So having seen all that you have seen, what would you recommend to college presidents and to leaders in the United States about this legitimate protest that's going on college campuses?
Well, people should just take a long, deep breath, because this is not new. This is not, I mean, we've had worse eruptions on university campuses in this very country in the 60s, in the 70s, and so on. And I think there is a level of overreaction sending riot police into university campuses. It exacerbates it. That's just a personal opinion. But if I were President Shafiq at my old school, Columbia University, I can see how it might be difficult to know what is the right thing to do when you face a lot of conflicting pressures to act in one way that comes with its own consequences. But above all, whatever it is that leaders do, and even when they have to do something that is not particularly good or decent, they should not enjoy doing it too much. Because sometimes you have to do some bad things, some tough things, in order to end a particularly unstable situation. But it should not become a habit. And that's where, you know, human frailty comes in, and people get locked in a certain way of reacting to a crisis and are not showing enough confidence and patience, because some of these things are fevers that, as we've seen in the past, that can you know, subsequently subside. And they just need to be treated in a certain way. But I am not sitting in their chairs. We have a college president amongst us. So I don't envy you, because we all know these young people, they might seem even unreasonable to us. But that we were equally unreasonable. When I was at the University of Lagos in the late 70s, we were storming the British High Commission, taking down the flag and climbing the embassy wall, because Zimbabwe was going to be free on January 1st, 1980. So we didn't want to wait for January 1st. So we stormed so people will look at us, our parents will say, these are irrational kids, and so on. I think we need the energy and the impatience of young people, but we also probably need a little bit of the long view and our many failures of the old people in the room, and to combine both to try and get in the right direction. But to your question, I just think a little bit of patience and restraint is particularly called for when tempers are high. That would be my. Yeah.
And Dr. Willis, I would love to just, as the Aspen Institute Ascend Fellow you are, I mean, there's like this simmering detention and now going violence and but also this bastion of creativity and new possibility. And since you've come from the Northwest to Howard County Community College, there's been sort of incredible growth and new opportunities, where I'm also sure also some grave challenges. And so I'm curious what it looks like from your leadership post in higher education. If you'd like to share, no pressure.
No pressure, just hand me the mic. It's good to see you again, Dele.
Good to see you.
Jump to the opportunity to come. But to the question that you posed, and based on what you're saying, I agree. There needs to be restraint. But what I would offer into this conversation is when you talk about the protests and such that happened in the 60s and 70s, who was leading those institutions at that time? And were the same calls for ouster of presidents happening for those white men who were leading the institutions when the students were protesting and doing all the same things that we're seeing today? And who are they looking at in, 2024? And who are the people that are leading those institutions? Because when you first looked at Columbia, the first thing they said about that president, who was a woman of color, ouster, she needs to step down, blah, blah, blah. We saw with Claudine Gay, and she didn't even have protests that were happening. Her contract, the signature on her contract wasn't even dry by the time they decided to move her along. And it's interesting in the last few weeks, though, now with people damaging property, how that has changed the perspective of these once peaceful demonstrations into what they have evolved to today. So I believe, in my personal opinion, as a president, it's my job to maintain safety. Everyone who comes to that campus needs to be able to go home the same way that they came. I agree with peaceful protests, and I believe that that is something that the academic enterprise needs to foster, especially in the US. I just think that we've lost, similar to what Dele has stated, that ideal that we can all sit in a room and have discourse and agree to disagree or agree, and it has to come to people losing one's lives over it. That's where I draw the line, or where we're disrupting property and all of these things. And I don't envy any of the presidents who are dealing with this. We have our own problems with it in Columbia. So I took this day to come out here and say, let me take a break, and I'll go back tomorrow so I can deal with it. But I think we need to be careful as to how we judge presidents who are in this seat, especially if we're looking at the rise of women of color and people of color in these positions, and how all of a sudden the way that we will grade them on how they have behaved is much different. And that conversation wasn't even having to be had in the 60s and 70s, when today people are saying you don't need an education. And this, in my opinion, is just a way to attack the industry of higher education.
Thank you so much, Darian. I'm curious, I'm going to use it as a jump for you also, Dele, on the US again is in this sort of very stuck spot, especially when we think about what does it mean to let go of power, position, or privilege, to accept leadership of people of color, women, to stand behind, because not only is it, the attacks are coming from not even the political, but even from like the governance system of boards of directors and so forth. And I'm curious where, in 2013, the majority of children born in the US are children of color. They're non-white. We're like, as a country, we're really struggling, or not struggling, but there's a certain segment of, whether it's white supremacy, how can we learn from Rwanda and South Africa, where it's such a different construct, but like starting at a completely different place that we are just rejecting?
I assure you that all this proves is that Americans are humans like everybody else.
We need to do that.
Nobody has ever, willingly almost nobody, unless you have like your Mandela level, your George Washington types and so on. Those are once in 200 years type of leaders. The default position for most human beings is that you may talk the game, but you don't really want to relinquish the thing, really. But some people fight harder than others to stop the changes from happening. This is going on in South Africa, it's going on all over the world. In China, obviously, in India, right? So I don't think people should despair about these things. We're just in a moment where our problems are amplified extraordinarily loudly by the new technologies that we have. We do not have the worst problems in the world, in America or in South Africa or elsewhere. Yeah. It's just that these things are now in our faces every day and every minute, right? I was reading some statistics before, and this is not to minimize it because every death is horrible, but police violence in America compared to, say, the 60s or the 50s is way down, right? It still is wrong, but because we have our phones and cameras, we can see everything every day, it distorts our perspective. Now, we should fight those things, and perhaps one useful thing about it is it causes us to want to act to solve them. But I just caution us to not fall into the trap of thinking, woe is me, these problems are so big we can't solve them, and this is the worst it has ever been. It is not the worst it has ever been. So that would be my retort to the young people in South Africa, that you don't even know what you're talking about. Did anybody put a pencil in your hair to determine what your racial category is? Or to separate a family because they said, you know, one color should not have been marrying another one, and then forcibly remove them from their property, throw people in prison, torture them in their tender regions. I have friends who went through all of this stuff. South Africa no longer does any of those things. So it's a hugely different country. It's an astonishing achievement. But when the power supply is no longer reliable, the commuter train is not running, people think that is the worst thing that has ever happened. And they should think that way to have the energy to try to fix it. But let's not depress ourselves to think that the challenges we face, whether in the US or South Africa or Rwanda or China or India or elsewhere, are so big and insurmountable that we have an excuse to become paralyzed and do nothing. Yeah. We should be impelled to action and constantly seek ways to make things better. As who was it who said, do not let the best be the enemy of the good? I'm quite happy to take progress, not perfection right now, at this stage of my life. So
well done, well done.
I stole that from you, Miguel.
Madam Ambassador.
Thank you so much, Anne and Dele. It's incredibly delightful to hear what you have said and to talk about my country, but I'll be remiss if I don't also talk about my country if I'm sitting in the room. And what we have said, and especially I want to talk about the issue of pivoting, you know, where are we going and what we are, how far we are. One of the things when we compare South Africa and Rwanda, even though there are some stuff we can share, but we are coming from two different perspectives. In, you know, South Africa was coming from a racial type of background where people were separated, even in the neighborhood. Genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda was almost pitting brothers against brothers. Mm-hmm. So it's within, it's an intimate violence when we talk about this thing. Mm-hmm. So the choices we made that are really what led us to here now where we are. I have to say number one is that we decided to be united no matter what. Mm-hmm. But it's a hard work. You know, to be united when you look at 1 million people dying within 3 months in a small country, 3 million living, and then trying to bring that reconciliation where now we've built one of the best systems I can find. It took a lot of work. But one of the things I just wanted to say, maybe as I'm sitting here, we are happy. It's a cultural thing. We don't smile that much, but seriously, that's from a long time it was not within our culture to even, you know, now we are trying to tell our people, please dance so people can say that we are happy people. But that's pretty much a cultural thing.
By the way, I was in Kigali a couple of weeks ago for the commemoration of the 30th anniversary of the genocide.
Yeah.
And I was attending an event with your president, at which somebody in the crowd said, you know, Mr. President, maybe part of the reason you are criticized so much is that you don't smile enough.
You don't smile. That's another story. But what I'm saying, even when we say President Kagame is authoritarian, it's to a point. He's rigorous. He has rigor. And this is something all Rwandan people have done when we made those three choices, to stay together but also to be accountable. So every Rwandan is kind of really, we drive ourselves to do the best, and sometimes it's reflected like being harsh, but it's not. And the other thing that also I have to say is we pivot, especially for pivoting, is that one of the barometer to judge why we have been able to develop is because we always put people in the center. Mm-hmm. So our democracy might be not reflected like U.S. democracy, but when you look at the tones of dialogue, when we started with what they call Rugwiro dialogue, when we come up with what we call consensual democracy. But if you look, for instance, in our government, even now, so I just want to say it, and you can go and prove it. Since 2003, when we changed the constitution, number one, it was to account to everyone. So when women are coming, it's not because it's a quota or it's because the women are just figureheads. We are taking the people who are driving our economy, our chief of technology, our chief of the
development bank.
Every single thing is a woman. And now they are being taken by the whole continental Africa, because they are really performing. So it's not a matter of putting them there. So President Kagame, because maybe that's one of the issues when we talk about this pivoting you are talking about, because I want you to maybe give me something, is that every single thing was to build brick by brick. Mm-hmm. We came from a system that had completely collapsed. So looking at the context, the history, we had to take all the people together and to be able to get to where we are going.
Thank you, Ambassador.
But now, the choices that you are saying also, that you say it's the choices they are making, and I agree with you 100%, it's because even the president were choosing him now. Because we had to ask, we said we are still living in a safe world. Genocide in Rwanda ended, but we live in a stable neighborhood. So we still have to maintain certain gains, because like you rightly said, the first thing was to ensure peace and security. You can't develop if you are afraid to be cut by machete. So that's the top, and with no apology, because that's the basis for any development in any part of the world. But I agree with you, with the young people I have here that are full in our ministry, in our government, we are not even afraid of taking the baton when the baton is ready to be seized, because that's exactly what we are doing.
But that's actually one thing I failed to mention when I was discussing Rwanda. Yeah. I have never seen any other country on earth, and I've been to over 100 of them, where young people are in such highly responsible positions, in such numbers. Yeah. Just anywhere you turn in Rwanda, it's like people in their 20s have incredible responsibility and doing it. So, yes, I do acknowledge this, Ambassador. Thank you for your comment.
Thank you so much.
Alyssa.
Oh, wait, actually, and the last question back there? No, right here.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So Dele, one of the great writers from your country, Wole Soyinka, said 30 years ago that South Africa was a hope and Rwanda was a nightmare as Africans and as the world, really. Mm-hmm. And I think for me as a South African, my name is Palisa Murudi, I'm from South Africa. I live here in Washington, D.C. right now. I think that that sense of freedom in South Africa is our biggest strength. Mm. It is really about keeping power in check. We can vote people out of power if we don't like them. There is an established system of a peaceful transfer of power. So if the system no longer works, we can change it. And I think that's, like you alluded to, that we're beginning to do that with new parties and all of that. And I don't know if people are able to change a system if you don't have that sense of freedom. You're not able to change. And I think that's what we're seeing in the United States. I mean, this whole noise and very loud conversations, discussions that are, uncomfortable, messy, and all of that. It's part of just that sense of freedom to be able to speak your mind. And I think that is a very big strength. And I'm wondering if you would agree with this view that what you spoke about systems change, if you don't have that freedom to be able to change the system, and you have what you refer to as an authoritarian rule, that it doesn't allow for a system to change unless it's overthrown.
Okay, so you make a very good point. The preferred option is when people consciously, acting as citizens, decide to change the system they have themselves through established means. But that does not mean that you cannot have change in an authoritarian system, because most of the change we have seen in the world actually came out of moving away from authoritarianism, or orange revolution, pink revolution, green revolution, whatever it is. People always find a way when it gets to that point. But it's an easier and perhaps less turbulent way to have these changes occur when the citizens are free to decide it themselves, right? Rather than have to announce, as it happened many times during my youth, that another colonel or major has taken over the public television and announced himself as the new president after shooting his rivals. We don't want that. I think we've had enough killings in our lifetime. So a peaceful way of changing a system that is not working for most people clearly is the preferred one. But change is possible either way.
Yeah. Well, change is possible because standing still is not an option. And, as we kind of wrap up, because time always goes fast, but we'll be back here tomorrow morning for those who are coming with their solutions. Kidding. You can mail them in, actually. Here at the Institute, we like dialogue, we like action, we like solutions. But I really, these are things I'm going to sort of kind of put out into the ether, sort of in my closing thought, is, as I mentioned, last spring I was my heart was so heavy and I was angry. And I got on the plane, and of course I was with amazing people, and my job is to ask good questions and care for folks among a team and make a little good trouble. But was how important it was to step away from what was keeping me up at night and holding and feeling so heavy. I could step out to come back and see with some new possibility in eyes. And it was an extraordinary privilege to be able to go all the way to South Africa and Rwanda with amazing people and leaders. Yet it happens if I am open, if I'm curious, and also the smallest of interactions. How I walk into a school and greet a teacher. How I get onto a bus and do I share a spot, give a spot? These small acts matter, and especially after, I believe, the past kind of 3-5 years where we've gone through so many shocks to our hearts, systems, and society, to being in sort of pragmatic conversations, who's essential, who's not. The dramatic dehumanization, I think if we could ignite and really crack open our hearts, as James Baldwin said so beautifully and only he can, but crack open our hearts and unlock our civic imagination, let us aim higher. Because when I think about the work that I'm privileged to be a part of here at the Aspen Institute, whether through Ascend or the Aspen Forum on Women and Girls, I think from a leadership, innate hunger, or just as individuals, we all want to be part of something bigger than ourselves. We all want to be a little bit more, a little bit better. And the environment right now is not necessarily, at least in the United States, always calling or making that easy. But I think I invite us all to really think a bit more on your personal balcony. What is the power and possibility and passion you have in yourself, in your role? And I'm not saying this Pollyanna, because I get the whole structure system thing. Trust me. That's at noon tomorrow. But I really want to push into, because when we dream and we're not defending, let's give people something to be for, as well as to fight and to call out the wrong. So that is my sort of closing offering to all of you. And I just think there's nothing more magical than being around amazing, brilliant leaders who are huge of heart and mind. And Dele, what would you like to close us out with your thoughts, where you're seeing hope, imagination?
Yeah, I mean, we all go through dips. Emotionally, you think, woe is me, everything is falling apart. But the idea of leaving one's self open and eyes wide open to see, to perceive, will clearly pull you out of whatever depression you are feeling, because there are always people doing the most extraordinary and beautiful things. And you just say, wow, we can actually fix this, right? So I think the way that I've kept my enthusiasm up through everything that I've experienced around the world is the gift of being able to just see what is possible and what the human imagination is capable of achieving. And we see that everywhere. In South Africa, I've seen the most extraordinary people throughout my life. I mean, the most extraordinary people. Most of them you've never heard their names before. In the last years of apartheid, there were people, I mean, no cell phones, no internet, nothing. If they needed 40,000 people in the streets in 2 hours, they organized it. They were the most dynamic young people in every corner of the country. They sacrificed, they were tortured. I have a friend, he just turned 62 the other day. When he was 17, and they marched him off to prison because he was the leader of the high school resistance. And in prison, they put him in solitary confinement for 18 months and were torturing him with electrodes in delicate parts of his body. He's moved on into a new country that is possible. They're not wallowing in what their experiences were. These are remarkable people. I can't even begin to talk about the Rwandans that I've met, the Americans that I have met, the people who, in the face of incredible... I saw John Lewis, I ran into him at JFK. I was flying out of the country just the year before he died. And I saw him face to face for the first time. We were queuing up to go through security. So I just went and just hugged him. And then I said, thank you. Because these people are extraordinary human beings. They show us what is possible. And if we open ourselves to that possibility, to be alive to that possibility, then we cannot but be hopeful that things will be better everywhere. So thank you for this opportunity.
Dele, thank you all for coming, all of our members out in the community. You are not only a chronicler of change, but you are a creator of change and possibility. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne.